thought it would be just another show of force. A routine power trip. A police officer patrolling Griffith Park spotted a man sitting alone, looking too calm, too still. Without warning, he approached and struck him with his baton, never realizing he just made the biggest mistake of his life. Seconds later, the officer learned the hard way: he had picked the wrong guy. Before we continue, subscribe, share the video, and drop your city in the comments. Let's dive in. The afternoon sun poured over Griffith Park, casting golden light through the thick canopy of oaks and sycamores. Families lounged on picnic blankets, kids chased each other along the paths, and joggers kept their steady rhythm. The park buzzed with life. But away from the crowd, one man sat quietly on a worn bench near the shade of a grove. He wasn't on his phone, didn't even have earbuds in. One boot rested on the other, and he tossed birdseed with calloused hands to a flock of pigeons pecking eagerly at his feet. He wore worn jeans, a faded shirt, and an old cowboy hat that shielded his face. His silver belt buckle had lost its shine, and his trimmed beard showed every year he'd lived. He looked like someone who'd seen it all and didn't need to prove anything anymore. That man was Chuck Norris. He wasn't there to fight. He wasn't there to impress anyone. For once, he was just enjoying a quiet moment, an old man feeding birds, blending into the background. Until the silence was broken. Heavy boots thudded against the pavement, growing louder with each step. Officer Dan Cross was on patrol, his LAPD uniform spotless, sunglasses mirrored, and every item on his belt polished and ready. He walked like someone who didn't ask questions, just gave orders. But those who knew him didn't see him as a protector. They saw a man who enjoyed power, who used it like a hammer whether or not there was a nail. He didn't serve, he controlled. His eyes scanned the park and locked on Chuck. One man. Sitting too still. Feeding birds like he had nowhere else to be. Cross didn't like it. To him, that kind of calm looked like defiance. And in his world, defiance needed to be crushed. Without a word, he marched over. His fingers brushed his baton, ready to make an example. A few people paused. A woman with a dog slowed. A group of young guys at a picnic table exchanged glances. They'd seen Cross do this before. They knew what was coming. Cross stopped in front of the bench. Hands on his belt. Shadow stretching over Chuck. But Chuck didn't flinch. The birds didn't scatter. The breeze kept blowing. And that was the moment the officer realized he hadn't just picked the wrong man. He'd started something he couldn't finish. The wind rustled the leaves overhead, carrying with it the scent of freshly cut grass and sun-baked asphalt. Officer Dan Cross exhaled through his nose, already annoyed. This was the moment when most people looked up, recognized his authority, and adjusted their tone. But not this man. The old guy didn't even flinch. Didn't turn his head. Didn't stop feeding the birds like Cross wasn't even there. That wasn't gonna fly. Cross shifted his weight, cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice sliced through the air, sharp, official. But still, nothing. Chuck Norris didn't blink, didn't glance up, didn't acknowledge a single word. His hand calmly scattered another handful of seeds onto the pavement. The pigeons pecked away, undisturbed, as if they hadn't noticed the brewing storm right next to them. Something flickered in Cross's mind. It wasn't fear. Not yet. But it wasn't just irritation anymore either. For the first time in a long time, his presence alone wasn't enough. And he hated that. He stepped closer, the toe of his boot stopping just inches from Chuck's foot. His hand drifted toward his baton, muscle memory kicking in. He had no time or tolerance for defiance, especially from an old man who clearly thought the rules didn't apply to him. The sun was beginning to dip, stretching shadows long across the grass. The city's hum stayed steady in the background. Kids still laughed. Joggers kept jogging. The world moved on. But within that small circle of space surrounding the bench, everything had shifted. The air felt heavy and charged, like the moment before lightning cracks. Officer Cross stood tall, rigid with authority. His boots shined. His belt gleamed. His stance screamed power. He had issued the unspoken command, and he expected movement. But Chuck didn't move. Another handful of seed hit the ground. The pigeons kept pecking. The bench didn't creak. Chuck didn't even seem to register Cross's existence. That quiet resistance, no words, no gestures, rattled the officer more than an angry shout ever could. People didn't ignore him. Not when he wore the badge. Not when his voice demanded obedience. That was how the world worked. But right here, right now, it wasn't working. Cross's fingers twitched. He'd dealt with plenty of difficult people before, drunks, street punks, loudmouth protesters, but this was different. This man wasn't resisting. He just didn't care. As if Cross wasn't even worth acknowledging. The thought twisted in his gut. He buried it. Fine. If words didn't work, he'd make himself clear. With a sudden crack, Cross slammed his baton against the bench, just inches from Chuck's leg. The sharp sound ripped through the air. Pigeons scattered, wings flapping into a frenzy. A few people nearby looked over. Some paused. Most shrugged and went back to their walks and conversations. But Chuck didn't budge. Cross's patience snapped. His voice rang louder this time, harsh, commanding, full of that authority he'd always counted on. But all Chuck did was shift his hat ever so slightly, lifting the brim just enough for sunlight to catch the edge of his beard. Still no words. No fear. No challenge. Just calm. But not passive. Not weak. It was the kind of calm that came from knowing exactly who you are, and knowing no one can shake that. Cross felt it then. Not fear, exactly. But something cold and uncertain creeping into the back of his mind. He wouldn't back down. Not now. With a frustrated grunt, he reached forward and grabbed Chuck's shoulder, firm, forceful, the way he'd been trained. And that's when everything changed. Because the moment his hand made contact, Chuck moved. Not fast. Not wild. Smooth. Controlled. Effortless. Before Cross could even register it, his wrist was trapped in an iron grip. Not tight enough to hurt, just enough to send a message. A message that was louder than anything he'd ever said in uniform. And suddenly, it was Officer Dan Cross who couldn't move. A surge of alarm shot through Officer Cross's chest, raw, primal, undeniable. He'd faced resistance before, suspects who ran, guys who lashed out in panic, but this wasn't panic. This was precision. This was the grip of someone who had done this before, many times, and always on his own terms. For the first time in a long time, Cross felt his confidence crack. He yanked his arm back, and to his relief, the old man let go. No bruises. No marks. But the memory of that grip? It lingered. Burned into his nerves like a warning. Cross took a shaky step back. Inhaled hard. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was the one who gave commands. He was the one who initiated. And yet, in seconds, he had been the one to retreat. His jaw clenched. No, he wasn't about to let some old man make him look weak. His baton was still in his other hand. He gripped it tighter now, knuckles whitening. No more warnings. No more theatrics. This time, the strike would land. He raised the baton and aimed for the man's shoulder, expecting him to flinch, recoil, show some sign that he understood who was in charge. But as the baton came down, Chuck moved. Just a small shift. Barely noticeable. A subtle turn of the torso. But it was enough. The baton sliced through air, hitting nothing. Before Cross could recover, that same hand wrapped around his wrist again. Calm. Controlled. Unshakable. And in one fluid motion, the baton was gone. Not ripped away. Not fought for. Just taken. Cross's heart slammed in his chest. He had trained for hand-to-hand scenarios, had years of experience subduing suspects, but it didn't matter. In less than 5 seconds, his weapon was no longer his. And Chuck? He didn't even hold it like a threat. He just looked at it, as if weighing its worth, then let it fall. The baton hit the ground with a soft clack. Cross stared at it, breathing uneven. Everything had shifted. The uniform, the badge, the weapon, none of it mattered now. The illusion of control was gone. And Chuck had barely moved. A few people had noticed. Teenagers murmured to each other. A couple of dog walkers slowed, unsure whether to step in or stay back. Most just watched, drawn in by something they couldn't quite name. Cross's fists clenched. His pride burned hot in his chest, a wildfire of frustration, confusion, and something more dangerous. Something that felt uncomfortably close to fear. He had one move left. His fingers twitched toward his holster. And Chuck was already watching. The baton lay on the ground between them, a silent symbol of power lost. Of a line crossed. Cross's breathing hitched. He could feel the eyes on him now. The pressure building. The weight of choice. He reached for his gun. Slow. Instinctive. The final answer. The thing no one could take away from him. His hand wrapped around the grip. But then, he hesitated. The rage, the tension, it was all still there. But another thought sliced through it, sharp and cold. This wasn't some street brawl. This wasn't a loudmouth teenager or a cornered dealer. Something here was off. Cross had served for 15 years. He'd stared down drunks, gang members, desperate men with nothing to lose. He'd pulled his gun before. More times than he cared to admit. But this time, this man. He didn't act like he was afraid. He didn't act like a criminal. He wasn't tense. Wasn't shifting weight, ready to strike. There was no fight or flight in his eyes. Just stillness. Calm. Confidence. And that was what terrified Cross the most. There was no tension in the old man's body. No clenched fists. No preparation for a fight. Only stillness. A deep, unshakable calm that made the air feel heavy, like the seconds before a lightning strike. And then, finally, their eyes met. For the first time, Officer Dan Cross truly looked into the eyes of the man in front of him. They weren't angry. They weren't smug. They were steady. Patient. Quietly watching, like someone who had already figured out the outcome and was just waiting for you to catch up. Something cold slid down Cross's spine. Doubt. His grip on the gun slackened slightly. A bead of sweat trailed down the back of his neck. The world around them seemed to vanish. The kids. The joggers. The breeze and the trees. All gone. All that remained was the heat of the sun, the sound of his own breathing, and those eyes, still watching. A voice, soft but sharp, whispered in his head, "Don't do it." But pride has a voice too. And pride screamed. His fingers tightened again. And in one motion, he drew his weapon. But he never got the chance to aim. Because the moment the gun cleared the holster, Chuck moved. What happened next would haunt Cross. Later, he would try to explain it. Slow it down in his head. Break it into steps. But the truth? It was too fast. Too clean. Too perfect. 1 second, the gun was in his hand. The next, his wrist was caught in a grip like steel cable. Not painful. Just final. And then, his weapon was gone. Not ripped away. Not fought for. Just taken. Now Chuck Norris stood before him, holding the gun with the same calm he held the baton. As if it meant nothing. Cross froze. His hand still hung uselessly in the air, gripping nothing. Around him, the murmurs grew louder. Someone gasped. Someone whispered a curse. A teenager lifted a phone, recording. The weight of all those eyes hit Cross harder than any punch. Chuck turned the weapon over once, silently, inspecting it. Then, like it held no real value, he bent down and placed it next to the discarded baton. And straightened up. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Cross swallowed hard, his throat dry. The reality settled on him like a slow, crushing wave. He hadn't just lost control, he'd never had it. Not for a second. And the most devastating part? Chuck had never even thrown a punch. Cross's hands curled into fists. Heat surged through his neck. Shame and fury tangled in his chest like a storm. Then his eyes caught movement. Someone was still filming. It hit him like a gut punch. This wasn't just humiliation. This was evidence. And in that instant, something inside him snapped. He moved before he could think. Before he could stop himself. Anger took the wheel. Panic pressed the gas. He lunged. Desperation drove his body forward, a last-ditch grab for dignity, for control, for anything. But Chuck Norris had already seen it. The moment stretched, thin and taut. Cross moved, but the outcome had already been written. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't training. It was a drowning man reaching for air that wasn't there. His arms swung forward, empty, wild, no weapon, no authority, just raw, unfocused instinct. And instinct was no match for mastery. Cross didn't even see it. 1 second, he was lunging. The next, he wasn't. His wrist was caught again. Twisted. Not painfully. Just perfectly. His momentum vanished. His knees folded. And then, he was weightless. For the briefest moment, his world tilted. Then, he was on the ground. Not slammed. Not thrown. Just placed. Gently. Like someone setting down a box of fragile glass. One moment he was standing. The next, flat on his back, staring up at the sky. And for a long time. He didn't even understand what had just happened. The sound of the crowd grew louder, creeping in from the edges of Officer Cross's awareness like a tide he could no longer hold back. He heard the voices now, gasps, short bursts of whispered disbelief, fragmented questions. But it all felt distant, like it was happening in another world. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. His mind scrambled for logic, for explanations, but none came. His training, his instincts, his years of authority, they offered him nothing. And then, like a dam finally breaking, the reality came crashing in. He had been taken down. Easily. Effortlessly. Without violence. Without rage. Without even a hint of struggle. There was no brute force, no chaos, no fight to speak of. Just precision. Calm. Control. And he had lost. The shame hit him first, hot, suffocating. It curled in his gut like molten lead, dragging his pride into the dirt with it. He could barely breathe through the weight of it. Then came the panic. He had lost control. Not in private, not in the shadows, but in public. And worse, people had seen it. Not just a handful of nearby walkers or joggers, but a growing crowd. Dozens now. Maybe more. Drawn in by the magnetic pull of something they didn't fully understand, but couldn't look away from. Some held up phones. Their screens glinted under the afternoon sun like mirrors reflecting his failure back at him. This wasn't just a moment of humiliation. This was exposure. His pulse thundered in his head. He pushed against the ground, trying to sit up, trying to gather what little dignity he had left. If he couldn't win, at least he could stand. At least he could appear composed. But before he could rise, a shadow fell across him. Chuck Norris stood over him, silent. His face unreadable. There was no arrogance in his expression. No condescension. No trace of the smug satisfaction Cross might have expected. Only calm. Only quiet assessment. He wasn't judging, he was simply watching. Waiting. And in that moment, something shifted in Cross's understanding. The old man hadn't held back out of fear. He hadn't paused because he was unsure. He hadn't gotten lucky. No. He had chosen this ending. He had controlled every second of the encounter. The fight, such as it was, had never even begun. Chuck had written the script. Cross had just shown up late to the stage. The weight of that realization nearly knocked the breath out of him. He clenched his jaw and scrambled to his feet, his limbs shaking, not from exhaustion, but from the kind of frustration that came when everything you'd built your identity on had just been torn apart. He knew better than to go for another strike. He wasn't that foolish. But pride has a way of rewriting logic. The silence of the crowd pressed in from every direction. Cross turned sharply, scanning the park, desperate for something, anything, to help him seize back even a sliver of control. And then he saw them. Two uniformed officers moving quickly through the crowd, parting people like a wave. Their hands rested near their belts, their expressions alert and uncertain. They'd seen the commotion from afar and were closing in fast. Relief crashed into Cross like a gust of cool wind. This was it. This was his chance to take the narrative back. With rigid authority, he squared his shoulders and straightened his uniform, ignoring how his legs still felt unsteady beneath him. Before they could speak, before they could ask questions, he raised a trembling finger and pointed at the man beside him. He assaulted an officer, Cross barked, voice sharp, trying to summon the tone that had always commanded obedience. I want him in cuffs. Now. It was his last weapon. His last shot at rewriting the story. At turning eyes and cameras back in his favor. But the officers didn't move. They hesitated. They had seen something. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to know that the situation wasn't as clean-cut as Cross was trying to present it. Their eyes shifted between him and the old man. Their faces tightened, not with certainty, but with doubt. Then one of them, an older officer, graying at the temples, eyes heavy with years on the job, stopped in his tracks. Not at the accusation. At the man. Recognition flickered across his face. Not for Cross, but for Chuck Norris. And in that instant, everything changed. The older officer's posture softened. His hand drifted away from his holster. The tension in his shoulders melted into something else entirely, something close to respect. Understanding. And then, like a ripple spreading through still water, the realization reached the second officer as well. Neither of them reached for their cuffs. Neither of them raised their voices or drew their weapons. They simply stood there, exchanging a look that said everything without saying a word. Cross felt something twist in his gut. Something deeper than fear. He was losing the moment. Losing the story. Losing the authority he had always assumed was unshakable. His hands curled into fists. His mind raced for a way, any way, to salvage what had already slipped through his fingers. Then the senior officer spoke. Dan. Just his name. Quiet. Firm. Unmistakable. But the weight behind that single word was enough to stop him cold. Silence spread through the crowd like smoke. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something deeper. Something final. In that stillness, the truth settled on everyone watching. Cross hadn't just lost a fight. He had lost everything that once made people follow his orders without question. And Chuck? He never needed to throw a punch. The truth was enough. And the hush that followed wasn't just silence, it was recognition. The entire park, once buzzing with tension, now stood still, held in place by the weight of a moment they'd never forget. Finality. Officer Dan Cross stood frozen, his body locked in the rigid stance of a man clinging to control long after it had slipped from his grasp. His jaw was tight, his shoulders stiff, but beneath the surface, his mind raced, grasping for an escape, for a reset, for anything that could undo what had just unfolded in front of a growing audience. But there was nothing left to hold on to. The authority he once wore like a second skin, the power he had once exercised without question, it was gone. The senior officer stepped forward. He was older, grayer, his uniform softer at the edges, worn from years in the field. He didn't carry himself with arrogance, but with the weary steadiness of someone who'd seen too much and learned from it. He looked at Cross, then at Chuck Norris, then back again. His face remained unreadable, but his eyes held something deeper: disappointment, understanding, final judgment. Cross's breath grew heavier. Each inhale sharp, bitter. "You need to stop," the senior officer said, voice low but edged with unshakable authority. Not volume, not threat, just experience. Cross opened his mouth, instinct ready to justify, to defend, to argue, but the words wouldn't come. There were no excuses. No version of the truth that could withstand the evidence everyone had just seen. And worse, he knew it. The crowd around them had changed. The murmurs had softened, but the weight of their understanding had grown. They had witnessed everything. The escalation. The attempt at control. The fall. They had seen a man in uniform reach beyond his duty and watched that same man fail without a single punch being thrown. A few whispered to each other. One woman still held up her phone, recording the aftermath with quiet, steady hands. The senior officer exhaled slowly, like a man who'd seen this before. Too many times. He looked directly at Cross. "Give me your badge." The words hit harder than any blow. Cross's gut twisted. Heat surged across his skin. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a moment. This was the moment. His entire identity, his years of service, his command, his pride, had always revolved around that shield. The badge on his chest. The power it gave him. The authority it made others recognize. Without it, he was just a man. His hands twitched. He tried to protest. "This isn't necessary," he muttered, but the words came out hollow. Weak. The senior officer didn't blink. Badge and gun. Final. Non-negotiable. The shame surged again, deeper this time. With stiff, shaking fingers, Cross reached for the badge pinned to his chest. It felt heavier now. Cold. He'd worn it like armor. Believed it made him invincible. But it hadn't protected him today. Slowly, he unpinned it and placed it in the senior officer's waiting palm. Then came the gun. Worse than the badge. Because he had already lost it once today, already felt the humiliation of it being taken from him, as if he were a child pretending to hold power. Now, he had to give it away. He hesitated. The grip familiar in his hand. The senior officer didn't pressure him. Just waited. Cross cleared the chamber, removed the magazine, and placed the empty weapon atop his badge. And the moment it left his hands, something inside him broke. The senior officer gave a small nod, his expression unchanged. Then he turned to the younger officer beside him. "Escort him out of the park." Cross's jaw tightened. Every part of him wanted to resist, to scream, to fight, to claw back what had been stripped away. But there was nothing left to fight for. A hand touched his arm. Firm. Steady. The younger officer, quiet until now, stood beside him. Not with aggression. Not with anger. Just waiting. Cross moved. The walk felt endless. Every step across the grass weighed heavy, like he was carrying the burden of the entire moment on his back. Behind him, the crowd watched. Some silent. Others murmuring. He didn't look at them. Didn't meet a single pair of eyes. He couldn't. His uniform, once a symbol of presence and power, now felt like an empty shell. By the time he reached the street, everything felt different. The fabric on his body was just fabric now. Without the badge, without the weapon, he was no longer Officer Dan Cross. He was just a man who had lost everything. Behind him, the park moved on. The moment was over. The tension had passed. Life was returning to its rhythm. And at the center of it all, Chuck Norris stood exactly where he had been. Still, silent, unmoved. He had never shouted, never raised a hand. He hadn't needed power to prove anything, because he already was what Cross had only pretended to be. The crowd that once gathered in confusion now looked at Chuck with something else entirely, something deeper than respect. Recognition. And as Cross disappeared from view, Chuck Norris turned back toward the bench. Without a word, he sat. The pigeons returned, unconcerned with the chaos of human pride. They picked at the birdseed he scattered, with the same calm patience he had shown all along. It was over. And as it had always been, justice had spoken.